Okay, so I'm back. So I'll talk to you a little bit about one application area of cognitive science, which is usability engineering and UX design. It's a large area. Normally, well, I have a class for the whole semester in this topic, but I'll try to give you some overview of that and some interesting examples of that. Okay. So this is a little bit of overview of the talk today. So to tell you historically, usability as it is now known to be, it started around like late 80s or early 90s. There was a book by Don Norman. It was initially called Psychology of Everyday Things. It was published around late 1970s. I forget the exact year. Later on, they rebranded it as, now if you buy it, it's called Design of Everyday Things. And I'll talk to you about that book a little bit later. But so basically, even though usability as it is, it started in the like early 90s, because also early 90s was the time when the computer, well, actually from 80s, basically computers were available, like people had personal computers. So usability issues were coming up, like how do ordinary people who are not computer technician, how do they interface with computers and things like that. But first I want to show you some examples of what I call prehistory of usability, that even though usability was as a term started from like the late 80s or early 90s, actually people were doing usability for a long time, from long time back. So actually some examples, just these I will go very quickly. There's a very classic map by Minard, who was a French, so it was a Minard, French cartographer. And so this was in 1869, and this is a map of Napoleon's march onto Russia and retreat. Okay, and this map is considered as a very classic example of a very good design, because it actually, what it shows is that on one graph, you see first of all he uses color, and this part is the march of Napoleon's march towards, this is Moscow. And so you can see the width represents how big the army was. Okay, and like here you can see that part of the army they went separate way, and they actually didn't take part in that. The dark part is the retreat. Okay, so they didn't actually engage in this thing, and here they joined the retreat, so they came back. This is the retreat part. Here they also the temperature of what was the temperature at the time, and anyway, I don't want to say too much about it, but in like one map, he packed a lot of information actually, So for example, here you can already see that these are rivers actually, and you see that river crossing used to be very dangerous, because every time they had to cross a river, the size of the army shrunk a quantum. Okay, so now this is again like almost like 150 years old or something like that. Okay. Now here is actually another interesting example, also a French, I don't know how you call it, it's not a map. What this is it's actually a timetable for the trains from, this is Paris and I forget, Lyon maybe, So the interesting thing about this map is that you see here what they did is that this is time and this is distance actually. So the distance between these stations is proportional to the distance between them. Okay, so the lines show. So, for example, this shows trains that are going from Paris to Lyon, and this shows trains going the opposite direction. Now, this map actually was designed not for passengers. It was designed for people in the control room. Control room meaning that, I don't know if you know about how the trains work, that it still is the same thing. That so for example, take Zagreb. Zagreb is a junction, so there are many platforms here. Okay, but once you go out, there are usually two tracks or sometimes even single track. Okay, so the trains share the track. So if the trains have to cross, they have to always cross at some big station, because then they can go to one platform while the train is waiting. If you travel by train, you must have some situation sometimes that your train is delayed because some other train is delayed. Okay, and so the point of this representation, I would call it, is that this actually allows you to see where the trains cross. Okay, so if you are in the control room and you have to figure out, and remember nowadays of course we have computer apps for everything, but this was almost like sorry, wait a minute. Yeah, so this was almost 140, 150 years ago. So in those days they had real map. So what this map allowed a controller to do is that if some train is getting delayed, they can draw another line to figure out how to adjust the train timing so that they could figure out which train to slow down, which train they could make wait so that the trains could cross safely. Okay, this would be very difficult to do in a traditional timetable which is designed for passengers, because you have to do a lot of calculation actually, and figure it out. And this is very simple. You can just have a ruler and draw a line. The train is running late because you have times here, so you can say, okay, this train instead of here, it's starting here, so I draw a different line, and they can then figure out how to manage the crossings of the train. Okay, so the point is that this is a design for controller. It's not very good for passengers, of course. It's not very useful, but it's so actually, of course, now as I said, everybody uses computer apps. But when in Japan, when they started bullet trains, so again, this was before there were so many computers. They were actually using similar design in the control rooms of the bullet trains to make sure that to manage basically the train crossing. Okay. This is actually another example from prehistory, which is this is a London Underground map from 1908, and you can see that this is actually what they did was that this is actually a map of London, and they just put the lines on there and then put dots where the stations are. Now this is actually I mean, it's geographically accurate but not very useful. And there was a guy, Harry Beck, you can read about him. And in 1931, he came up with this design actually. I should say this, he was actually a circuit designer, and this design is based on how electronic circuits are designed. You have components and you show the topology of the network, not how they are put in there. And he used that as a model to show how the stations are arranged. So initially, when he came up with this design, his bosses, they were very angry with him. They rejected his design because they said it's inaccurate and it's distorting the things. But the thing is that it's very useful for two things. If you want to know the order of the stations and if you want to know where to change trains, this design is very useful, And so basically for this, he had to stretch out the center of the city, and this is again a standard design. Most cities now use this schematic for metro. Okay, so this is actually if you read about him, he actually died in, I forget, I don't remember, maybe 1970s or so, and it's only I think in 1990s the British government finally recognized his design, even though people were using it for all these years. Okay, it's very interesting to read about this guy's history. Now, the examples I showed you so far, they were not really user studies because they were designs when people thought about what kind of information the customer or the user needs, and they designed it, things like that. Now, I want to show you an example of a real usability study actually. This again predates before the word usability came about. You probably know, I don't know, have you, all of you have seen or some of you have seen Sesame Street? Okay, it's a very popular program. Now I want to show you how much research goes into every little thing that you see. And this is from 1960s. So basically this is a quote from the producer of the Sesame Street in 1961-62, something like that. So what he said is one of his academic colleagues, this is a producer saying, he got a grant for doing research on what interests children. So he thought, oh, Sesame Street is a children's program, so why don't we collaborate? So they thought of different ideas. So basically they wanted to know if Sesame Street, how interesting is a Sesame Street episode. So first they thought about like having, two programs playing side by side, and the child is sitting there, and they want to see where the child is looking. The child is looking here, the child is looking there. But they had some methodological problem with that, and this is that the methodological problem is that there is something called narrative pull. Narrative pull meaning that, like, I don't know, I'm sure you must have seen seen a movie or read a book, and then at the end of it you say, oh, I wasted my time, why did I do that, you know. Now you wonder, why did you do it? Because you could just stop at any time, nobody is forcing you. But this is because of narrative pull. People do it because they want to see how it ends, maybe it gets better towards the later or something like that, okay. So the point is that if you have these two programs playing like this, and if you follow that methodology, you get this confounding variable. Confounding variable is that if child starts looking at this one first, it will have a narrative pull. So maybe they are not looking at this one. You cannot really have this condition where you have the same child sit, like you have to like clone the child, put one in this room, one put in another room, one starts watching this, one starts watching that. So anyway, so there's this methodological problem. So then they thought, well, maybe we should try to put some distractor or something like that. Anyway, to make a long story short, they considered toys and stuff like that. But in the end, what they decided was that they will have a Sesame Street episode on one side, and on the other side they would have what they call competing audio-visual stimuli. So this is not a narrative thing, it's just some images, and competing means that they try to balance the color, texture or whatever, and the sound quality of whatever they are showing on the TV screen. So the idea was that because this doesn't have a narrative pull, they want to see if the program is boring, child might look at this competing audio-visual stimuli. Okay, and basically, so again, this is, you have to think about it in 1960s. They didn't have good eye trackers and all, so they had some research interns standing in the back, and every 7.5 seconds they were recording the child is looking A, B, B, you know, they have two things, and they're just looking at the head movement of the child, you know, okay. So they found that it was very interesting. They got good data, and then to assess the validity of, they also, this also shows you how thorough they were. They wanted to check that this method actually works. So they took, there's a series called Captain Kangaroo, and so they looked at it, and they had a particular episode of it which was kind of boring, where one of the character explains the US Constitution to another character, and they thought it would be very boring for 4-year-old children. So it's like, you know that this is boring, and now you want to see if the method captures that aspect. And what they found was that, as expected, the distractor data was very revealing actually. They showed that as soon as the character started talking about the Constitution, the children looked at the distractor. And as soon as they heard the word, now a word from Mattel, they jumped back to the, I don't know if you understand what was going on. Mattel is a toy company, and they were the sponsor of the Sesame Street. So that means ads, and children love to see ads of the toy company. Okay. So anyway, they did this. And they also compared the results from the Nielsen rating, which is, you know, things like that. But anyway, so that's the first, at least example of actually usability testing I could find from this 1960s. And you could see that, you know, Sesame Street is a very successful children's program, but you see how much research goes into that, you know, because they would have much of the data comes from, like every 7.5 seconds they were getting, you know, data on is it interesting for children or not. Of course, they would not do it just for one child. You can take 10 children and then you can collect their data. And so they could see that if the children are getting bored, they think, oh, maybe we left that character too long. And it's like they get a graph like a stock market or something, you know. And so that allowed them to really fine tune the program. So what you see in finally in the program, it comes after all this testing. So that's why it's one of the reasons that it's a very successful program. Okay. Okay. So this is just some examples of like I call it prehistory of usability. And anyway, so this I already talked to you about it. And so this E.L. Palmer, the quotations, all the quotes I was giving were from E.L. Palmer, who was one of the producers of Sesame Street in the 60s. Okay. So like I mentioned to you that the usability actually started in one way by this book by Don Norman, The Design of Everyday Things. The original title was Psychology of Everyday Things. It's a very interesting book, and actually a very interesting thing to do about this book, if you read it, is that now you find revised edition that was published in 2001 or 2002, something like that. But if you compare the two editions, the original edition and the revised edition, there are very interesting differences, and I'll tell you about them in a little bit. So basically, in this book, he talked about a lot of some principles of usability, and he was considering simple things like doorknobs, design of ordinary things like this kind of benches and tables and things like that. And this is a sort of in a way summary of the book that he proposed 5 principles of usability. Visibility, which means that whenever you are interacting with whatever interface or object, it should be very clear what are the operation points. Okay, he talked about feedback. Feedback means that when you take an action, it should be very clear if the action is taken or not. So to give examples of that in the context of website, so visibility means that like if you open a page, it should be clear what are the clicking points, what are the buttons. Feedback means that if you click on a button, it should be clear if something happened, So like many times you fill out a form online, and then you say submit, and then the form just comes back. So you don't know if it's submitted or not. This is like poor design. In a good form, it should say, okay, form submitted, the screen should change. Okay. Actually, I've mentioned you one example of visibility, or some visibility is not just about visibility. So take for example, maybe I mentioned the example that he gave in his book. So it was in the 1970s or so, and he was in some European city, and there was some public building, could be a post office or a bank, and somebody it has a very nice architecture. I don't know, it could have been Zagreb, I don't know which city, could be Vienna or whatever. But the interesting thing was that there were these glass doors, and in those days they didn't have this kind of doors, so you have to push at it. And there were these glass doors, and he went through. So there were double doors, they do it in winter and summers for buffering. So he went through. He pushed and went through one door, and he got distracted. And then this is his personal experience. He writes about it in the book. Then he got distracted. So then he went to the other door, and he pushed, and he couldn't open that door, And then he tried to go back. He pushed at the other door. Then he couldn't open that door either. So it was like scary because you are in this glass door. You see life is going on there, and you are stuck. You cannot open either door. And it's like a horror story. But anyway, then he noticed that somebody else just came in and went through the door. And basically, to make a long story short, what they had done was that the doors, of course, have hinges, And the architect designed it in such a way they wanted to make the hinges invisible because it looks aesthetically pleasing. But the result of that was that you don't know where to push because this is like one glass door. If the hinge is here, you push there, nothing will happen because you are pushing at the hinge. You have to push here, But there was no indication where to push, because it was a very beautiful symmetrically designed building. So his point was that because the action points were not visible, Okay. So there are other examples of that you see sometimes you don't know where to act, So this principle is basically that it should be. I have examples for each one of them, but I won't give them because we don't have so much time. I want to show you. Maybe I give you one example of feedback. Very simple example is one example is like bathroom fans, for example. So when you turn on a fan in your bathroom, it should make some noise. It should not be too noisy, but it should make some noise because if it doesn't make any noise, you don't know if it's on or not. Okay, because maybe it's not functioning, and then everything is steamed or something like that. And also, if we get a lot of steam regularly, then your the interior of the bathroom will you need to get repairs sooner or things like that. Okay. This is an example of mapping that the mapping is, you see that this is a lot of stoves are like this, and it's not very clear that which one is for the, they usually say, top left, top right, or bottom left, bottom right, but people get confused. Even people who are familiar with that, sometimes they turn on the wrong one. And you see this kind of mapping. The arrangement of knobs is mapped to the arrangement of here. Here people will not make mistake. Now the mapping is not just about, maybe do I have no, this is affordances. The mapping is not just about physical mapping. It's also conceptual mapping, and it has become a big thing in like last 10, 15 years. The idea is that you should design the interface according to the user model and not according to the designer model. I'll give you a very good example of that, which is Google Docs. I think you all use Google Docs or at some point or another, right? You're familiar with Google Docs. If you look at the history of these interfaces, so you know the word processors have been around since the 60s or 70s, since the computers started. People have been doing making word processor. Microsoft has been making Word for a long time. Now, one of the very Microsoft Word still has that. A lot of these apps have one feature that you always have to save your document. Okay, you have to save it. In Google Doc, you never have to save, right? And so now the save function is very interesting because people who, I don't know if you understand why you have to save. I've taught computer science to like non-computer science majors, you know, and one of the very difficult thing to explain to them is why do you have to save? Because they, you know, like it's very non-intuitive, because normally if you have a piece of paper, I'm editing it, I edit it here. I don't need to save anything, right? I get what I see. But in computer thing, so you are editing this document, you think you're done, all the changes are there, and then you leave, and then you lose it. Next time you open the file, it's not there. Then you have to explain to them, wait a minute, look, the computer has this two-stage, you know, there's one memory, there's another memory, a copy is made out in here, and blah, blah, blah. And that's very counterintuitive. So that's an example because the interface is designed according to the designer model, because they have two-stage memory. So they said, okay, you have to do save and things like that. And again, if you follow the history of word processor, take for example Microsoft, what they started to do slowly is that, so if you look at the like 1970s and 80s, if you leave, you know, if you quit after without saving, you just lose your document. Later on, they started to put a warning that if you try to quit before saving, it will give you a warning. Do you want to save your document? And then people say, what do you mean by save my document? Why would I make these edits if I didn't want to save it, you know? Okay, it confuses people, you know. And then later on, they started to do autosave, which is also confusing. So if you have autosave, for example, and then you open the document again, it tells you, do you want to have the last saved version or something like that? And people say, what's the last saved version, you know? It's very confusing. Now, when the Google Docs started, they just said, okay, let's do it. There's no save button on the Google Docs. It always saves, okay? But of course, it has its own problem, because again, the designer model is different, because the problem is that everything works well if you have continuous connectivity. Now, the problem with the Google interface is that you sometimes, you know, you have a shared document, you are doing something and you make comments, and then you say, oh, I see my comment. Your partner who you are working with say, oh, where are the comments? I don't see them. And say, oh, but I have them. What's the problem? It's because you have to click on the comment button, because all the comments you make are on your local copy, you know. And until you click on the comment button, they don't go on the cloud actually, you know. So this is again a feature that is, you know, so it's a little bit better than Word, but it still has some problems because it does not correspond to the user model. Okay. So anyway, so these are some examples to illustrate that in design, nowadays the focus always is that you should actually figure out what the user model is, how does the user understand this device or whatever, and you hide everything that the designer's features are. I mean, you try not to, they don't need to learn about how it's implemented, you know. They should have a model that they should use as they think about it, okay. So anyway, so this is an example of affordances that, so you see some designs there here, like in some doors there is push and pull, and you notice that in this one there is no, you don't need any direction, because to push there's no way to pull that one, you know, you can only push it. And the other one, you can actually push at it, but pulling is more natural, because to push you have to use your knuckles to go like that. Okay, so this affordances actually comes from Gibson from the 1950s, Gibson and Gibson, and so they have this idea that affordance means that it takes into account your body shape. You know, people also now talk about cognitive affordances. So cognitive affordances is that how you think about it mentally and whether the device has that functionality or not. Okay. Anyway, so so this is, I give you just a very brief snippets of the original book by Don Norman. So actually, if you look at again, if you read the original version of the book, he thinks about usability as a purely, I would say, usability point of view. So for example, if you were to consider the usability of the chair, it relates to is it comfortable if I sit on it? If I sit on it for 1 hour, does my back hurt? Or like if you sit on this bench for 1 hour, are you sore or things like that? You know, it doesn't consider you like the color of the bench. Well, that's not relevant on how you feel about it after 1 hour or so. Well, maybe, you know, but so what happened basically? So the book, Design of Everyday Things, was written around like 1970s or 80s. But in 1990s, there was a big movement towards recognizing emotions, you know. So for example, this Descartes' error by Damasio, and there was a whole, this emotional intelligence came about, and people started to recognize that emotions actually play a very important role in decision making. They are actually a very important part of our cognition. And this older model of like rational, quote unquote, rational thinking is not very good, you know. Okay, sorry, I'm using simple words like not very good and stuff, but I think you know what I mean. And so he wrote another book, Emotional Design. This is Emotional Design by Don Norman, and he actually recognized that, well, we need to consider things like color of the bench and the color of the chair, because they have an impact on how a person feels overall. Okay, and that was kind of a shift from usability to user experience. Okay, because user experience is about the whole experience. You know, how I feel about it, and how I feel about it is not just if my back is sore. Sometimes the color makes it feel better. You know, and things like that. Okay, so the thing I was telling you is that if you read the newer edition of the Design of Everyday Things from like 2002 or 3. Then he actually incorporated a lot of things from the emotional design book, you know. So it's very interesting to compare the two editions. Okay. So anyway, so I'll just give you some examples of what is meant by emotional design. So this is again a very brief summary of the book. He identifies three aspects of emotional or emotional aspects that influence design. One is visceral. So visceral means that something that appeals to your raw senses. So that's a very good example of that. So you see that if you see most of the ads for motorbikes, they employ pretty female models. Now you think about it, what's the point of that? Because these pretty female models have nothing to do with the functionality of the motorbike. Okay, but because they are appealing to the young male, you know, that's their target market audience. And they think that these pretty young models will appeal to the young males, you know. Okay, so that's the reason for that, you know. Maybe actually there's a very interesting example of this phones. Actually, before phones, I don't know. Maybe a very interesting example is this what they call them, iPods. You know, when Apple started iPods. So initially, I think they were introduced in 2001 or so, and Apple design was very revolutionary because at the time there were many music MP3 players, you know. But Apple design was very simple, minimalistic. They didn't have many buttons and you know things like that. But it was this big, a little bit heavier device. And then they came up with 2 or 3 years later, I think 2003 or 4, they came up with iPod Nano. And iPod Nano was sleek, smaller, but very interesting thing about iPod Nano was that it came in colors. There were 4 colors. They were turquoise, hot pink, I think maybe green, and some. They of course had black and white as well. And that was a big selling point. They were saying, look, this iPod Nano, it comes in color. And I use this example of Nokia because around 2007 or so, Nokia introduced, I don't know if it's this one, but they introduced a series of phones, and they also came in bright colors like iPod Nano. And I seen that they bought some very expensive slots for advertising. It was on some big sports series or something like that. So you know, those they cost like sometimes $1 million or so to get just one spot because it's a very I don't remember this, but some high, you know, high visibility popular sports event. And the ads were, they all focused on the color of this smartphone. I remember one ad. So there was this. It starts in black and white, and there's a kind of a pretty could be, you know, a European village or Japanese village, because it has this kind of wooden bridge over a stream, and then a pretty model walks. It's all black and white. And then she goes over the bridge and she throws some colored powder onto in the water, and then the camera goes onto the other side, and then this colored water becomes this colored rivulets, you know, and then the message will be bring color to your life or something like that, you know. So the point is that, I mean, in this case, they are not focusing on functionality of the phone or anything, what it can do. All they are showing is that it's color, it's vibrant, you know. So that's again appeals to your visceral level. It's very similar to these, you know, putting female models on the motorbikes, which have nothing to do with the functionality of that. Anyway, so that's an example of visceral aspect. The behavioral aspect, there's also an interesting story about it. That, so you see these are cup holders, you know, the coffee cup holders. And the sort of the anecdote about it is that until, I don't know which company, maybe one of the American car companies, until this time, everybody, of course, in the US, you know, people drive a lot, they drive long distance, and then people need to drink and things like that. So usually, they would buy accessories. You know, you can buy these accessories to attach using like suction cups or something, so that you can put your hot coffee cup or Coke cup or whatever. And one car company, they started to make this built-in coffee cup. So you know, they can. This is not from that era, but just to tell you. So you see that this is the built-in. It can slide in. You can put it in. You can take it out, and it's sturdy, you know, because it's part of the car. So you don't have to attach it vacuum, whatever, the suction cups or something. Now the thing is that that's the feature of the car. Now you see, it has nothing to do with usability in the sense that if you think about the car, you think, oh, the car, how it drives, what is the mileage it gives. And so anyway, the anecdote about it is that when this company started to put these cup holders, they used it as an advertising feature that, look, our car has, you can imagine they will have this scenario where somebody has this suction cup thing, and then they are driving and they put their coffee in there and it comes off, the coffee spills, they get coffee on their lap, and the ad will say, oh, look, buy our car, it has this built-in coffee cup. And so sometimes people think it's stupid because say, well, who would buy a coffee cup, car based on the coffee cup? But well, if you think about it in detail, how do people buy cars? The way they buy cars is that first thing is that they decide the budget. That's the main thing, how much money you have or you want to spend. Second thing, you want to see how big a car you want, okay? Then it narrows it down to maybe 2 or 3 models. Then you go and drive them, and then you feel like that. Now you can imagine that when you go to this car, the salesperson will say, oh, you know, look, it's this nice cups, and you know, when you go for long drives and things like that, it will be very you know, useful and stuff like that. And they say, yeah, they drive it. And at the end of the day, the person might say, oh yeah, I find this car more interesting. They don't say, I find it more interesting because it has the coffee cup holder. It's like overall feeling, you know, and that's the whole point of user experience. It's about the overall feeling. You might say, oh, I like sitting in this chair. It might be because of the color. You don't say, oh, I like it because it's blue. But, you know, your brain, in a subconscious way, you absorb all the kind of things, you know. So anyway, that's an aspect of behavioral aspects. These are emotional aspects because they are not connected directly to the usability of the device or whatever you are thinking of, okay? But nonetheless, they have an effect on how you like it or how your experience of that device is, okay? And there's a reflective level. Reflective level is interesting because they in a way go counter to usability, because if you look at, these are examples of some watches, and there's a binary watch, there's another one. And if you actually do a usability test on them, it will take longer time for people to tell the time, okay? But nonetheless, sometimes people like certain things because it's exclusive, you know. So that's called reflective level, you know. They say, oh, I am unusual, you know. Like I have my watch, it's a tactile watch. You can tell the time by touching it. It's actually designed for blind people, but I actually have known about it, and I've had it for like 5 or 6 years now. So I can tell time in the dark. And the most important thing for like even sighted people, that if I'm talking to somebody, I can tell the time without breaking eye contact, you know. Normally you look at the watch and people say, oh, do you have an appointment or something? And I don't need to do it. I can say, okay, because then I can figure out, oh, I have 10 minutes left, so I maybe cut short the conversation or something like that, you know, okay. So anyway, this is an example. I'll be brief now. So there's some other aspects of emotional design, design for fun, design for trust, design for social interaction. I'll just show you some pictures. These are some another like books by this guy Steve Crook. They are mostly about website design and usability testing, and this fun design, like so sometimes you design things. So these are all aspects of emotional design. You know, you design things for like these beach slippers. They are, you probably see them in Christmas market. Time people sell them, and they are kind of fun. You know. Okay, this is actually a story, interesting story about it. So this is a musical urinal. So one of the the design issue with the male urinal is that basically encourage the male to aim properly. Okay, actually about 20 years or so ago, in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, they had remodeling, and one of the big things that everybody was talking about is that in the male urinal they put a fly. The fly is still there, but at the time it was new, you know, and everybody was saying, oh, they put this fly. This was to encourage people to aim. And I want to tell you this little news story that it's a real case. So in which year was, I think it said 2015, so like 8 years ago. This case came on the German court that does a man has a right to urinate while he's standing or not. Now you might wonder why did it come to the German court, and it had to do with the fact that the what happens is that in a normal toilet when you urinate standing up, it splatters, and the urine has acid in it, So I guess this man was not very clean, so they didn't clean the floor properly for the time. So when he was leaving, I don't know, after some time, there was damage to the tiles, And so the landlady claimed that, well, this is a damage to the tiles, so I want to deduct from the deposit. And the man said, well, that's a normal wear and tear, because, according to your rental contract, if it's normal wear and tear, then you don't have to pay, right? But if it's something you damaged on, like, big damage, then you have to pay for that. So the man just said, well, if you urinate standing, it splatters, that's a natural this thing, so I don't have to pay. And in the case went to the court, and the German court said that, okay, he has a right to do this, and so the landlady or landlord didn't get this thing. Anyway, the point of it is that this is all design issues, and this, I think I have it later. Actually, there's some other examples of this. For example, boyfriend pillow, this is made in Japan. There's also knee pillow. There are all kinds of interesting, fun designs, And I think I'll skip this part. I think I won't say much about it, that these are how cognitive science applies to usability research. There has been a lot of studies with reaction time experiments, psychophysical experiments, and things like that. And yeah, I think I won't say much. Sorry, this one. Yeah. This is also, I should mention this nudge theory. It's called Shikakeology also. In last 10 years or so, it has become a big thing. The idea is how to change the behavior of the people by design. Okay, so as a matter of fact, this the design of this fly on the male urinal is a kind of nudge theory. This is an example where this is in Japan, that they put this religious symbol. The idea was to discourage man from urinating against the wall. Okay, so this is actually, there are, if you Google them, there have been also some very, like in San Francisco, somebody designed this surface where they actually show it by pouring water on it. If you pour water on it, it splashes back on your face, So, but this kind of thing that if somebody did it once, then they will never do it again, Okay. So this has become a big area actually. One of the problems, I had a creativity workshop last week in Renata's class, and one of the problems that I give them is a big problem right now, is that how to make sure that people, when there's an emergency landing, how do people don't carry their carry-on luggage. They always tell you that in case of emergency landing, please just leave your luggage behind. But nowadays everybody has phone cameras, so there have been cases when there have been emergency landing, and they say people coming down with their laptop bag or whatever, and people get mad because fortunately nothing happened, but it could be that the plane explodes a second later and some lives are lost because you are getting your thing. So at the moment, it's all done by honor system because they tell you, but it's a big problem actually. The airlines have been, there have been some ideas about how to prevent people from doing that. Somebody suggested like locking the overhead bin, but some people say, oh, then maybe people will take more time because they'll be struggling with it to get their suitcase out and things like that. Anyway, so I won't take much more about it. This is also the idea that this usability doesn't just about objects. It also applies to things like weighting system, for example, you know, how you design weight like in supermarkets and things like that. This is also in a book by, a recent book by Don Norman called Living with Complexity. Actually nowadays this usability is used in or user experience in many things, like for example public services. Nowadays I don't know how it is here, but a lot of governments are trying to be friendly. So when you apply for a passport or driver's license, they actually give you a number and you can track it down, you know, what's happening to your process. So it will say, okay, it's here, it's here, it's here, okay, it's done, you can pick it up. Because it's, of course, they don't have to do it in a way because the government has no competition, they can do whatever and people will, you know, deal with it because what can they do. But these days there is a focus to make it user friendly and things like that, you know, okay. So anyway, these are some solutions for weights. You know, you probably have seen that sometimes they use spatial double buffering. So there are two lines and the person serves here and there. And this is especially in cafeteria because people take time to, I don't know if you do it in your Mensa, but the people take time to count their change or something. This is efficient, you know. So they serve this person and then while the person is getting out, they serve this person, they serve this person and things like that. One line feeding multiple servers and things like that. And actually, I'm going to skip this part. This is tell you a little bit about how to do the design. And I want to just show to the end part now. And so I want to just tell you a few words about this contemporary approaches to, it's called SOMA design. So the idea of the SOMA design is that traditional design is based on language and logic. And SOMA design is based on body and movement, so it's embodied design. And one of the person is this Christina Hook. She's in this KTH in Stockholm. She has a very interesting lab. I know her. I visited her in October, and they work with a lot of different materials. They have, for example, she has knitting machine, crocheting machines, sewing machines, all kind of 3D printer, plastics, and they work with a lot of material. And their idea of some of the key aspects of this SOMA design is that first of all they focus on first person perspective, you know. So this is like how you feel about it, you know, and then they call like slow storming as opposed to brainstorming. So you take your time. Sometimes you take 6 months. You have meeting. You have some experience. You think about it. You contemplate. There's no rush, okay. And then the design evolves slowly. Another thing is that, you know, testing and retesting, so to use design as an open-ended process, and also use kind of dynamic gestalt. Dynamic gestalts meaning that, you know, gestalt theory is that you have some gestalt, and the dynamic gestalts in when the gestalt itself is changing. It's a little bit like what I showed you in the beginning, the interaction process diagram. Okay, and I want to just mention some other books. They are related to this kind of SOMA design approach. So, for example, this Invisible Women, it's a very interesting book about how the modern, actually a lot of the designs are is based on man's perspective, you know, and it's actually very interesting. It takes very simple things you might not think about. So, for example, I'll give you one example. That in Sweden, in some village, they were trying to be gender inclusive, and they thought, at least they thought, well, snow plowing, that should not be, there's no gender issue there because this is plowing the snow. And then she identified actually it's a very big gender issue, and the reason is that if you look at the man's movement patterns and women's movement patterns is very different. So, in most societies, males they go to work, so they drive. Usually families have one car, usually the man, in most cases, the exceptions of course, the man has the car, and the women's movement usually they're taking care of children, they have job, they have sometimes taking care of elderly people, they do shopping. So their movement patterns is what is called chain movement pattern. They go from one place to another, they go another place, they tend to use public transportation, they tend to walk or bicycle, they sometimes have a pram if they have a baby or something like that. So if you think, so if the point is that from a snow plowing perspective, in this town, they used to, their model was that they first would plow the big street, big roads, and then they would plow the small roads and sidewalks. But that's very, it favors male population because they have to drive, so their roads are clear. And women are, their footpaths are, they are lower priority, so they will come to that eventually. So they find that in this town, they actually changed the perspective after this discussion. And they found that the accident rate in the winter dropped almost half or something like that, because a lot of accidents they used to happen is people slipping on the snow, walking people and things like that, and usually women, because they are the ones who are walking for, because I mean they are, they just look at the daily life, and these are of course statistical thing, the daily pattern of movement of women is very different from the male pattern. Anyway, just one example, but there are a lot of very interesting examples. This is a recent book actually, so it's not so old. Actually, they are all recent book. This critical fabulation is also, it's about, it challenges this notion of universal design, so that you cannot have a universal design because you always have to look at your user group. So what works for one user group may not work for another user group, and they say it's perfectly okay. So you design things for a particular user group because it allows you to include or consider minorities, different kind of ethnic groups, and you focus on who you are designing for. There's a very interesting anecdote about it, that in some village in I don't know, it could be Africa or India or something. So they were some UN organization. They were looking at them to see that what was the problem the women were facing. So they did they looked and they observed, and they noticed that they had no running water. So the women used to bring water from some nearby river or something. So every afternoon, the women will go and they'll carry these 3 or things of water in their head, and they'll bring it. And they said, oh, that's hard for them, and we should try to get running water to them. So there was a project. They brought running water to to them. And then, but the women were not happy because they thought, oh, we get these 2 hours away from our mother and mother-in-laws, because they were usually young women who were doing this job. And they, I mean, maybe not everybody, but some of them liked this. They were away, normally their mother-in-law or mothers were always trying, do this, do that, and they could get away and have fun with their friends. They would sing and whatever. So the point is that, this paternalistic perspective that, oh, I go and look at it, oh, this is a problem, I will solve it. That's the thing that this book complains about. So you always have to be inclusive design. You have to talk to people, say, what's your problem? I mean, what can we do? So it's nowadays called like co-design or something like that. So you design together with your user group and not like come from an outside. And again, to say we don't care for universal design. You just assume that there's no universal design. We design for this particular group of people, and we see that it works. Okay. So anyway, so that's the end of my talk, and this is the last slide, and I stop here. Okay. So again, to say that. For design, you have to, like as I said, you have to work with the user group, you have to talk to them, watch them, be with them, and design for them. So thank you for your attention.